In this Baldur's Gate 3 guide, we're going to be talking a bit about multiclassing and what you gain from multiclassing, how multiclassing works in Baldur's Gate 3, and whether or not you should consider multiclassing your build. And there are absolutely a lot of things that factor into whether you should multiclass, and we'll get into what each of those are in this video. But I do want to mention that although multiclassing isn't typically recommended for beginner players, I would say in Baldur's Gate 3 it's a little bit more forgiving, and that's for a couple of reasons. First of all, there is no longer an attribute or ability score requirement to multiclass, meaning you don't really have to plan ahead much in terms of like what your ability scores are in order to meet the requirements to multiclass with other classes. That's been removed. But the other thing is that you can respec in this game for rather cheap, and you can always save and, respec again if you don't like how it came out without wasting that gold. So it gives you a little bit more freedom to play around, and your choices are not exactly permanent like they would be in tabletop. So there's a little bit less, punishment for getting it wrong. You can just try a few times and then figure out what you like, what you don't like, and then go with that. And one thing I want to mention before we get into the nitty-gritty details of multiclassing is that if you're playing on the Explorer mode, the easiest mode of the game, you actually cannot multiclass. It's been disabled from the game. And if you want to play on this difficulty, but you still want to multiclass, you actually need to set the difficulty of the game up to balanced, and then you can do your level ups and then set it back down to Explorer. You can kind of bypass it that way. I don't know why they did it this way. I assume they just don't want new players making terrible multiclassing choices that might make it difficult for them. But because you can load the game so much and because you can respec, I don't see that as a problem. So if you are playing on Explorer and you do want to mess around with multiclassing, that is kind of a workaround. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about here is proficiencies. Anytime that you level up in Baldur's Gate 3 and you select a new class, you will gain some proficiencies from that class. You won't gain all of the proficiencies of that class as if you were selecting that class during character creation. So for instance, if you chose Fighter to multiclass into and you had any other class to begin with, you would not gain the heavy armor proficiency. That is something you won't gain when you multiclass into Fighter. But if you start with Fighter, you will gain heavy armor proficiency. So keep those things in mind when you're trying to decide what class you want to begin the game with, because you won't gain all of the proficiencies of a class when you multiclass into it. And you can see what these proficiencies that you'll gain are on the right-hand side of the screen when you click each class. And keep in mind that these are not factoring in what you already have. Like, they're not adding to what you're missing. They are just simply telling you what you're gaining. So if it says, for instance, that you're gaining martial weapons or simple weapons or something like that, and you already have martial weapons and simple weapons, you're not really gaining anything. You already have proficiency in that. So it's not factoring in what you already have and telling you what you're gaining out of what you already have and what's missing. It's actually just telling you what you're gaining, and if you already have it, then you already have it. And the other thing is, to keep in mind with proficiency-wise, is that when you multiclass into a bard, into a ranger, or into a rogue, you're also going to pick up a new skill proficiency. So that's very, very useful in that particular case. And in the case of rogue, you're going to pick up 2 expertises, which basically doubles your proficiency in a skill that you have proficiency with. So multiclassing into 1 level of rogue is going to gain you 1 skill plus 2 expertise. That is huge right there on top of, the proficiencies you gain, which you probably already have if you're multiclassing in a rogue, unless you're like a pure caster or something like that. So those aren't particularly applicable, but those skill proficiencies could be very, very useful to you. And the other thing is, if you pick ranger, you'll get to pick 1 skill from their proficiencies, but also you can gain more proficiencies. For instance, if you take bounty hunter from their favorite enemy at level 1, you gain investigation proficiency, or keeper of the veil will give you arcana proficiency, or Ranger Knight will give you history proficiency, or a Sanctified Stalker will give you religion proficiency. So you could gain 1 skill plus that, and then if you take Natural Explorer and pick Urban Tracker, you could pick Sleight of Hand proficiency. So you could actually pick up 3 skill proficiencies for taking 1 level of Ranger, which is huge. And of course, besides the proficiencies and skills that you gain, you'll also gain all of the class features of that class at that level. So if you're like a Fighter level 3, for instance, and you pick up 1 level of Rogue, you will gain the class features of level 1 Rogue. And then if you pick another level up at level 5 and pick Rogue again, you will gain the class features of level 2 Rogue. And those class features will be the exact same class features for level 2 Rogue as if you were playing a Rogue yourself and you were a level 2 Rogue and you didn't have any multiclass. So those will be the same and you don't have to worry about that. So the next thing we're going to talk a bit about is multiclassing spellcasters and how their number of spell slots work and what level of spells they'll know depending on what levels they are of each class. So basically how this works is that if you mix any 2 full spellcasters together, these are Bard, Cleric, Druid, Sorcerer, or Wizard. If you mix any of these 2 together, you're going to have the same amount of spell slots as if you had a single class one of these casters. The spell slots will be exactly the same in terms of quantity. The difference is that you'll only be able to learn spells up to the level of spells you can know for each class. So, for instance, if you took like a level 3 wizard and a level 3 bard and multi-class them together, you'd have the same amount of spell slots as a level 6 bard or a level 6 wizard, but you would only be able to learn level 2 spells of wizard and level 2 of bard. And even though you have stronger spell slots than these, you won't be able to know higher level spells. You'll simply be able to cast the lower level spells that you have at a higher level if they can be cast at a higher level. So what you lose here is really access to higher level spells in exchange for more versatility of the spells you can cast. But one thing to keep in mind as well is that when you multi-class, the spells of another spellcasting class are going to scale with the ability casting modifier of that class. So in the case of Wizard Bard, Wizard spells are going to use Intelligence and Bard spells are going to use Charisma, which means that it's not exactly optimal because you're probably not going to have both high Intelligence and high Charisma. Probably have one of these high. So it's recommended that when you're multi-classing spellcasters, that they typically use the same spellcasting ability modifier. This would be something like Bard, Paladin, Sorcerer, even Warlock, since these all use Charisma for their spellcasting. These combinations work well together, some combination of them. Or something like Cleric, Druid, Ranger, as these all use Wisdom for their spellcasting modifier, so some combination of them would be better than mixing across ability scores. And this brings me to the next point, which is that Paladins and Rangers in this game are considered half casters, and Eldritch Knights and Arcane Tricksters are considered 1/3 casters. And I'll give you an example of why that's important and how that works in BG3. If you have a level 4 Paladin, they are effectively a level 2 spellcaster, or the equivalent of a level 2 full spellcaster. They will have the same amount of spell slots as a level 2 spellcaster would. If you compare Cleric, compare Bard, compare Sorcerer, whatever you want at level 2, they will have the same amount of spell slots as a 4th level Paladin. However, if you take a level 2 Paladin, which is effectively 1 level of a spellcaster because it's half times 2, and then you add something like 2 levels of Sorcerer, you actually get a level 3 spellcaster because you're adding 2 half levels and 2 full levels from Sorcerer. So that means the spell slots this character is going to have is the equivalent of a level 3 Sorcerer or a level 3 Cleric or a level 3 Druid. So they'll actually have 4 spell slots and at level 1 and 2 level 2 spell slots. So they actually have far more, even though they're the same character level, they have far more spells when multi-classed that way. However, if you took like a level 2 Paladin and mixed it with a level 2 Ranger, you'd have the exact same number of spells as if you were a level 4 Paladin or a level 4 Ranger because they're both half casters. But keep in mind, just because you gain more spell slots, if you go 2 Sorcerer and 2 Paladin, you don't actually gain access to level 2 Sorcerer spells. Level 2 Sorcerer spells are going to be accessed at level 3 of Sorcerer, and since you only have 2 levels of Sorcerer, even though you have level 2 spell slots, you'll only be able to cast upscaled level 1 spells from Paladin and Sorcerer in those slots because you don't have enough levels in Paladin or enough levels in Sorcerer to gain access to level 2 spells. So there is an upside and a downside to multicasting spellcasters, and the upside is you usually gain access to spells you wouldn't otherwise gain access to, or in the case of multiclassing with a Ranger or Paladin, you'll typically gain more spell slots, and that's particularly nice on a Paladin because they can sacrifice a spell slot in order to use Divine Smite. So if you went 2 Paladin, 2 Sorcerer, you could actually have 6 Divine Smites at level 4 before you need to rest. So these are things you need to take into consideration when you're multi-classing spellcasters. And, you know, as you get more familiar with the game, this will get easier to do and more familiar with the spells. You might know what spells you want to take, but if you're a new player, this is going to be quite challenging because you're not going to be familiar with the spell lists. So it'd be quite difficult for a new player to multi-class spellcasters, and I probably wouldn't recommend that for a brand new player. So the next thing to take a look at when multiclassing is feats. Every 4 levels of a class, you gain access to 1 feat, and you can choose from a list of different feats, including ability score improvement, which is what a lot of people take, allowing you to increase your ability scores, which is one of the few ways in the game that you can do that. And keep in mind that this is not character level, this is class level. So in an ideal world, if you were multiclassing, you would still be able to get 3 feats. 1 at level 4, 1 at level 8, and 1 at level 12. Maybe you took 8 class, ranks of one class and 4 ranks of another class, and you'd still have all 3 feats. Unfortunately, a lot of the ways multiclassing works, the class features tend to be more important than feats in some cases, and it doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes it's like 7 and 5, or 9 and 3, or 10 and 2. So you don't always gain those feats, but you need to take a look at what you're losing by losing out on a feat sometimes versus what you're gaining and whether that's worth it or not. So keep in mind that you might be losing a feat if you multi-class, and how important is that feat to you. And you can go through the list of feats to see what these are, so you can decide, but that's something you need to factor in. And another thing that you should factor in when you're multi-classing martial classes is extra attack. At level 5, just about every martial class gains an extra attack. Barbarians gain an extra attack, fighters gain an extra attack, monks do, paladins do, and rangers do. So those 5 classes all gain an extra attack if they use their attack action on their turn at level 5. If you're a level 5 character and you decide to go 4 classes of fighter and 1 class of rogue, for instance, to pick up sneak attack, you lose out on that extra attack to gain a little bit of sneak attack. So is that worth it? I don't think that's a good trade-off. So keep in mind that at level 5, there is a sweet spot for these 5 martial classes that you probably want to hit that extra attack. And that doesn't mean you can't multi-class before that and then respec to 5 levels of one of these classes at level 5 so that you gain that extra attack. But you will probably want all 5 levels of those martial classes early as you can to gain that extra attack, because that improves their proficiency or their performance in combat rather significantly. And I don't think in most cases multi-classing is going to outperform extra attack. So what this means is that if you're playing a barbarian, fighter, monk, paladin, or ranger, you will probably multi-class after level 5, because you want to make sure you get that extra attack, and then you can start dipping into other classes. That's most likely what you'll do. You can mess around with it before level 5, but realistically, you're probably going to be multi-classing after level 5, which is a good ways into the game. And the same goes for College of Valor bards and College of Swords bards. They gain extra attack at level 6 if you take these 2 subclasses. So you probably won't multi-class these 2 subclasses of bard until after level 6 if you're going to multi-class them, because you want to make sure you get that extra attack as well. And keep in mind, too, that you cannot double stack extra attacks. Like, you can't take 6 levels of College of Swords Bard and 5 levels of Fighter and gain extra attack from Fighter and 6 an extra attack from Bard, and then you have 2 extra attacks. That's not a thing. If you want 2 extra attacks, the only way to do that is to take 11 levels of Fighter. That will give you an attack, an extra attack, and another extra attack. That's the really strong thing about Fighter, is that they gain that no other class does at level 11. So if that's what you're aiming for, just go Fighter for 11 levels. So that more or less wraps up our video on multi-classing, and I hope you learned some things about it. I hope you understand how it works a bit more, particularly from martial classes and spellcasting classes. And obviously every scenario is different, every class is different, and the way you multi-class might be different. And we're going to go into like specific breakpoints for multi-classes in our class guides and in our build guides. Like when we do our Paladin guide, for instance, we will talk a bit about what you will multi-class with how many levels specifically. So if you're looking for that, we'll have that in each of those class-specific guides. I think it would be way too long of a video to go through every possible combination of multi-classing here. That's why I didn't do it. I just wanted to focus on the basics of it more or less. And the last thing I want to say is just that don't be afraid to multi-class. You can save and reload. You can respec. There are a lot of ways you can tinker. It's really fun to tinker with multi-classing in this game, and I think it's one of the coolest things about it from a technical mechanics standpoint. So don't be afraid to do it, in my opinion. Like, you really don't have anything to lose if you have a save before you try it. You won't even lose gold in that case. And also keep in mind, like, maybe you're the guy who wants to go 11 levels of Fighter to gain the 2 extra attacks. Well, you're not going to gain that extra attack from levels 6 to 11. Like, it's going to be a long while in there. So maybe you want to multi-class in the meantime till you get up to character level 11 and then respec into level 11 Fighter, and then you can get those extra attacks. You can do things like that in this game. From level 6 to level 11, that's a huge stretch of Baldur's Gate 3 where maybe you can have some fun multi-classing until you reach level 11. Things like that are things you also want to think about, so don't be afraid to experiment.